Hi all, Rick here. One question occurred to a viewer, that is, how do cloaked vessels account for one another's presence and position during manoeuvres? Travelling by cloak is not a foolproof method of evading sensors, but it's still incredibly effective. Running at low power and reducing as many emissions as possible will help cloud a ship from long-range scans, and on top of this, there are a variety of scattering fields you can employ to disperse sensors. These, however, can show up as irregularities in scans to an observant enough system. The best method so far discovered is to create a bubble that warps emissions around the vessel before letting them continue on their way, appearing uninterrupted. Bending light, EM signals, and even sensor bands around the ship veils its presence. The technology, however, is harder to pull off in practice, as it draws a lot of power and cannot account for every particle or effect, leading to gravity profiles, subspace disturbances, and, depending on the model, tachyon emissions, signs that a cloak is in operation. Such vulnerabilities are often the subject of development in trying to eradicate these issues from both Klingon and Romulan empires, and this is all well and good, with the most effective cloak we have seen being installed on the scimitar of the Romulan Star Empire in 2379. However, making a perfectly undetectable ship raises some issues when it comes to close formation flying and setting up ambushes, to which we don't have a canon answer. How do they avoid collisions? It's all very well a single cloaked ship stalking its prey, but when it comes to fleet actions, how do they cope, as seen in episodes like The Defector and Redemption? So there's a variety of options that I can think of, only one that doesn't in some way compromise the cloak. The first is that between cloaked ships there is still a form of communication. This would be advantageous to allow constant contact when needed to account for manoeuvres. Such communiques would have to be lower powered, short range, and tight beam signals. The tight beam means that rather than broadcasting in every direction, like a mobile phone or your internet router, it is sending it as a signal down a focused direction. This reduces the likelihood it would be intercepted by someone you don't want eavesdropping and ruining the ambush. However, if at any time you lose contact with the intended recipient, then the sender may miss them altogether. Broadcasting normally would always ensure the receiver gets it, but so will every other communications device in range, intended to receive on that band. You could disguise the signal as background radiation or static, requiring encryption protocols to break, and while secure, it runs the risk of signalling your presence. Another method of staying in contact could simply be keeping tabs on something that is not prevented by the cloaking device, like an IFF transmitter. An indication of friend or foe is basically a unique signal on constant broadcast, and your ship has a database of matching signals to compare it to, so it tells you if you are meeting an allied or unrecognised vessel. If there was some sort of system in place that revealed the location of cloaked ships to one another, then you could easily manoeuvre in formation as normal, hiding in the same way as the communications ideas. However, the downside to this should be obvious too. If that signal is ever found out, then anyone can track the cloaked ship's position, friend or foe. Of course, they could always rely on tracking the same disturbances and vulnerabilities of the cloaking device that their enemies use, but these are problems that you're actively trying to remove. The only method I could think of that did not result in some form of communication that possibly could be intercepted was that there was no communications. A pre-planned pattern or very specific flight plan could be preloaded into each ship that they would then have to stick to, and defer all authority to a lead ship. This way, they would then move into position to ambush a target based on patterns of attack and rely on the lead vessels decloaking to match their reveals. This has the advantage of no extra signals being emitted to risk exposure. However, its biggest point of failure is that it leaves little room for adjustment and on-the-fly changes. With no way to track each other's presence, then as ships close in proximity, the risk of collision increases with deviations to the flight plan. In reality, it's likely a combination of all of these. I can imagine that several vessels are stationed around under Cloak with a designated coordinator when an enemy ship approaches. Before the vessel enters close sensor range, the cloaked ships send narrow beam communications to one another based on their last known positions as recorded by the lead ship. Instructions are then given out on a flight plan to surround the enemy, with the final command being to go silent, no further contact, unless in emergencies in case their chatter is being intercepted. They then all go properly dark and manoeuvre into positions, waiting on the decloaking of the lead vessel to trigger an ambush. If there are last-minute deviations to the plan, then the commander of the cloaked fleet has to weigh the danger of sending a new formation via tight beam to where their allies should be positioned, risking potential detection, against just triggering the ambush as is. Of course, the biggest advantage that the cloak has is not that it makes you undetectable, it's that enemies are not always looking for cloaked ships unless they have a reason to. There are detection nets, specific scans, and prolonged effects that either signal a cloaked ship or reveal one's presence, but they are not often a part of routine sensor sweeps, nor is sifting through background noise with a fine-toothed comb of an algorithm to uncover hidden communications. If a ship has no reason to suspect a cloaked ambush, then they're not going to be looking, and the likelihood of pulling off a coordinated fleet operation under Cloak improves exponentially. If a ship arrives, aware of a cloaked fleet's presence, then simply signalling, "We know you're out there," can often be enough to throw a spanner in the works, as it reveals that attempts at coordination might be detectable now and the operation compromised. Now, as for cloaking in a full-on firefight, well then I think things get both a lot simpler and more complicated. In battle, there are signals flying everywhere all the time, so I actually think a cloaked ship could be a lot freer to coordinate with allies, as combatants often have their attentions split across multiple fronts. Most cloaks too require the lowering of shields, which is a big risk in combat, so not a fantastic strategy in a large-scale battle with debris and errant fire everywhere. So what do you think? Is there another solution that I have overlooked, or do these answers satisfy? It's kind of that submarine tension going on, where you have to hide your presence and any talk is a risk, and ideally you'd make no detectable emissions at all, yet you still need to coordinate. I've been Rick, and until the next video, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.